Hey everyone, welcome back to HFI Covenant. My name is Jennifer and I'll be narrating today's story. This is a completely original human-written work of science fiction. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's jump right in. The gilded spire had not been built. It had been accumulated. Over 900 years of hegemony expansion, the station had grown the way coral grows on a shipwreck. Layer upon layer of conflicting architectural philosophies, each generation of engineers adding their flourishes atop the bones of the last. The result was a structure of undeniable, almost aggressive grandeur, sweeping atrium ceilings that caught starlight through polarized crystal panels, corridors of veined obsidian marble quarried from the Carith moons, and atmospheric processors the size of city blocks that hummed at a frequency calibrated to soothe hegemony sensory receptors. It was Princess Aelvynae of the Seventh Cascade thought, as she watched Lord Vethras of the Nebula Wastes flex 4 of his 6 arms in what he clearly believed was an impressive display. The most beautiful prison in the known galaxy. And it was there, in the belt of shattered core, that I drove my war lance through the hull of the Devourer-class Leviathan with my own hands, Lord Vethras continued. His chitinous exoskeleton caught the chandelier light beautifully. He had clearly spent time ensuring it would. The beast was 3 kilometers, tip to tentacle. They still sing of it in the outer reaches. Said Aelvynae. She was watching over the Suitors' broad armored shoulder, a section of ceiling panel in the upper gallery that had been slightly off color for the past 3 days. A faint water-stained darkness around junction point C-17 of the Eastern Atmospheric Trunk Line. She had flagged it to the station's senior engineers twice. Both times she had been told the discoloration was aesthetic, a settling of the century-old pigmentation compounds in the plating, and that Her Highness need not concern herself with structural matters. The plating had no pigmentation compounds. It was raw beryllium composite. She had looked it up. Your silence suggests awe, Lord Vethras said warmly. It is a common response. It suggests attention, Aelvynae said, still watching the ceiling. There's a difference. Vethras's mandibles clicked, the chitinous equivalent of a polite laugh. He was not accustomed to being corrected. None of them were. They came from every arm of the hegemony's reach, these suitors, warlords and merchant princes and heirs to old stellar territories. And they arrived wearing their power like a second exoskeleton, impervious and ornamental. They spoke of fleets, of lineage, of the political advantages of their various genetic configurations. Not one of them had looked at the ceiling. The reception hall of the upper spire was arranged for the pre-gala welcome assembly, the first of 3 formal events preceding the choosing ceremony. Translucent-skinned dignitaries from the pellucid reaches clustered near the cryo-vintage dispensaries. A contingent of hegemony guard, 6 of them, reptilian and stone-faced under their ceremonial plate, commanded by their hulking head guard, whose name Aelvynae had deliberately not learned because learning it would imply she intended to interact with him, stood in practiced parallelism near the eastern doors. Her vizier, ancient Thelon, materialized at her elbow with the quiet persistence of smoke. My lady, he murmured. Lord Vethras has paused. Convention suggests a response. Convention also suggested we invite 47 suitors to compete for my hand on a station that hasn't had a full structural survey in 60 years. She kept her voice pleasant. How is convention working for us? Thelon's translucent skin flushed with a faint amber. Discomfort. The spire is a symbol of hegemony permanence. The engineers told me a beryllium composite ceiling panel is suffering from pigmentation settling. She finally looked at him. Thelon, beryllium composite. He blinked his milky eyes. Perhaps the divine architecture has its own... Please stop. The old vizier fell into dignified silence. He was not unintelligent. He had guided her through the labyrinthine bureaucracy of succession politics since she was old enough to read treaty documents. But he had developed, over decades of service, a particular allergy to problems that fell outside established protocol. Things that didn't fit the established categories were, for Thelon, most comfortably attributed to divine will. Aelvynae had a deep and abiding respect for Thelon. She also found his epistemology maddening. She turned back to Lord Vethras and was preparing to deliver a professionally non-committal response about his Leviathan when she saw the human. He was in the upper gallery, the narrow maintenance walkway that ran along the interior face of the hall's upper tier, behind the ornamental filigree screens that most guests wouldn't know were there and fewer would care to examine. He had emerged from an access panel that was, by any reckoning, not meant to be opened during a formal reception. He wore faded blue coveralls, stained in ways that suggested intimate familiarity with hydraulic systems. He carried a canvas tool bag and a device that Aelvynae, who had taken 3 independent study modules in xenotechnical engineering, did not immediately recognize. He was at junction C17, her ceiling panel. She watched him crouch beside the junction without any of the theatrics of a person aware he was being observed. He set his bag down. He pressed one open palm flat against the panel, not checking an instrument, just pressing his palm against cold metal, and held it there for a long moment, eyes closed. Then he opened his eyes, reached into his bag, and produced a wrench. Just a wrench, a heavy manual, entirely non-digital wrench. Lord Vethras was still talking. Aelvynae watched the human work with a peculiar stillness spreading through her chest. He moved with an economy that was almost meditative. No wasted gestures. The wrench went to a specific point, not the obvious access coupling that any engineer would check first, but a secondary junction 3 handspans to the left. And he applied precise, measured torque. She saw him sniff the air, actually lift his flat nose and pull air across his sensory membranes with what looked like serious professional concentration. Then he reached into his coverall pocket and produced what she later learned, upon research, was a stick of polymerized tree sap sweetener, a human confection. He folded it carefully, pressed it against a hairline fracture in the conduit elbow that she could not have spotted from her position, and held it in place for a count of 10. A makeshift sealant, temporary, clearly, a patch to slow what he'd identified as a leak, while he arranged proper repair. The entire operation took 4 minutes. At the end of it, the subtle discoloration at junction C17 began to fade, as the pressure differential stabilized. He repacked his bag with the same quiet efficiency, replaced the access panel with barely a sound, and disappeared back through the filigree screen. Aelvynae realized Lord Vethras had stopped speaking. "My apologies," she said. "You were telling me about the Leviathan." "I had finished," he said, with wounded dignity. "Then I'm sorry I missed the ending." She glanced at Thylon. "Who is the subcontracted maintenance custodian?" Thylon blinked. "My lady?" "The human, in the coveralls. Who authorized his access to the maintenance gallery during a formal event?" Thylon's amber flush deepened. "I was not aware there was a human aboard, my lady. The janitorial subcontract is handled through—" "Find out," she said pleasantly, "and don't tell me it's divine architecture." She found him 2 hours later. This required bypassing 3 checkpoints by virtue of her rank, ignoring 4 separate advisors who appeared in her path like well-dressed obstacles, and descending 4 levels below the Spire's formal decks into the maintenance sub-levels, where the ceiling lowered and the floor was honest metal grating and everything smelled of ozone, machine oil, and the particular staleness of recycled air that had been through a filter one too many times. She found him because she heard him first, not his voice, but the sound of something being tapped against a pipe in a slow diagnostic rhythm. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause. Listen. He was in a corridor junction where 6 different pipe systems converged in a manner that had clearly never been intentional. There was a camp light magnetically clamped to the wall. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor with his canvas bag beside him and a schematic spread across his knees. Not a digital schematic, but a physical, paper one, annotated densely in a cramped script she assumed was English. He noticed her without startling. That was the first thing. He looked up from the schematic, assessed her with brown eyes that made no particular ceremony of the assessment, and said, "You're the princess." "Yes, you shouldn't be down here." He returned to the schematic. "The floor grating in Section D has a fatigue fracture. 3rd panel from the east junction. Don't step on it." Aelvynae looked at the floor, moved her foot 3 centimeters to the left. "I watched you fix the C17 junction. Slow leak. Patch holds for 72 hours. Put in a proper repair order for a new elbow fitting." He tapped the schematic. "Your engineers will ignore it. They've been ignoring C17 for about 6 years, based on the oxidation pattern." "How do you know it's been 6 years?" He considered the question with what seemed like genuine seriousness. "The way rust talks. Depth of the staining on the insulation wrap. Smell of the seal compound. The original one had a particular polymer base that they stopped manufacturing about 8 years ago, but it takes a couple years to fully break down under sustained pressure. He shrugged. 6 years, give or take. She looked at his tools. The wrench, a pressure gauge of a make she didn't recognize. Compact, analog, a collection of small containers labeled in that cramped English script. You identified the location without a sensor array, she said. Arrays tell you what they're programmed to look for. He set the schematic aside. The station's sensors are calibrated for the standard hegemony atmospheric compound. The leak at C-17 was emitting a trace of hydraulic buffer fluid. Compound series, your sensors don't flag because it's not on the hazard register for your species. But it smells. He tapped the side of his nose. Like copper and something faintly sweet. I caught it from the reception hall floor. She stared at him. He met her stare without discomfort. Human eyes, she observed, were extraordinarily steady. There was no iridescent membrane, no elongated pupil, just a flat, direct brown attention that somehow communicated more than she expected. What is your name? She asked. Jared Lawson. He extended a calloused hand, which she understood to be a human greeting gesture, and after a beat she took it. His grip was careful, calibrated, she realized. He knew exactly how much pressure he was applying. Lead maintenance custodian, Hegemony external subcontract, Gilded Spire station. You're alone? My crew is on the lower decks. The station's senior maintenance staff handle the formal areas. A dry pause. Or they're supposed to. The engineers who told me C-17's discoloration was aesthetic settling. Yeah, he picked up his schematic again. Those guys. She should have left. There was a reception dinner in 40 minutes, and Thalon would already be experiencing a controlled catastrophe of anxiety about her absence. Lord Vethras had apparently spent the last hours seeking opportunities to resume his Leviathan narrative to whoever would listen. She sat down on a section of clean-looking pipe instead. Jared Lawson looked at her with an expression that she was learning to read as the human equivalent of mild surprise. A very slight adjustment of the brow. He said nothing. He returned to his schematic. What else has been ignored? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his canvas bag and produced a second schematic. This one his own, she realized, hand-drawn on what appeared to be the reverse side of a supply manifest. He held it out to her. She took it. It was a diagram of the Spire's primary structural skeleton, focused on the atmospheric and thermal management systems. Sections were marked in 3 colors: green for functional, yellow for degraded, red for what she could only describe as alarming. There was a great deal of red. The Spire is old, he said. Old systems in old buildings. They're not quiet. They complain. The thermal regulators in the central atrium are running at 30% overcapacity because 2 of the 6 core heat exchangers have been offline for... He checked his schematic as somewhere between 2 and 4 years. The remaining 4 are compensating. They won't do that forever. Aelvynae looked at the diagram, her neck scales, the iridescent ones along her collarbone, the ones Thalon always said she needed to learn to control, flared outward. Why hasn't this been reported? Jared Lawson looked at her steadily. I've been here 11 days, he said. I've filed 8 formal reports through the contracted maintenance protocol. Each one was received, logged, and filed under non-urgent review, pending senior engineering assessment. He paused. That's the polite version of ignored. And the impolite version? Your station is screaming, he said simply. And everyone who's supposed to hear it has been too busy polishing the chandeliers. She came back the next day, and the day after that. She told herself it was due diligence. A High Chancellor of the Succession had an obligation to understand the physical infrastructure of the Hegemony's crown jewel station. This was reasonable. This was governance. She also knew, with the honest self-awareness that had always been her most inconvenient character trait, that she came back because the maintenance sublevels were the only place aboard the Spire where anyone talked to her like she was capable of understanding a true answer. On the second day, Jared showed her the structural flaw. It was in the Spire's lower core, the original foundation section, 900 years old and never upgraded, because the architects of each subsequent generation had assumed someone before them had handled the foundational survey. No one had. The station had been built upward in layers of trust and assumption, and at its base, in a chamber that hummed with the vibration of the primary gravity generators, There was a stress fracture in the central load-bearing column that had been propagating, slowly, patiently, with geological indifference, for what Jared estimated was at least 40 years. At current progression, he said, his voice carrying no particular alarm, the voice of a mechanic reading a diagnostic, not a prophet announcing catastrophe. You've got somewhere between 8 and 15 years before it becomes an acute structural concern. Could be longer, depends on load fluctuation. 8 years, she said, or 15. Materials science is not an exact. He stopped, looked at her face. I know. 8 to 15 years sounds long. It isn't. He crouched beside the fracture, running a thumb along its edge with that same flat palm attention he'd given the ceiling junction. The problem is the compounding. The overcapacity thermal regulators upstairs are putting additional vibrational stress on everything below them. The leak at C17 was pressurizing the conduit web in ways the structural model doesn't account for. Each thing by itself is manageable. Together. He made a small gesture with one hand, a slow spreading of the fingers. The station doesn't have individual problems. It has one problem that speaks in a lot of voices. She sat on the floor of the foundation chamber, which was entirely undignified, and looked at the fracture in the 900-year-old column and felt the weight of the station, the chandeliers, the obsidian marble, the 47 suitors and their combined ego, pressing down from above. What would you do, she asked, if you had the authority and the resources? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he sat down too, elbows on his knees, and talked for nearly an hour. He talked about load redistribution, about partial decompression of the upper thermal systems to reduce vibrational stress, about a repair sequence that would start from the foundation and work outward, prioritizing the interconnected failures rather than treating symptoms in isolation. He drew diagrams on his supply manifest paper. He talked about the column fracture the way a doctor talks about a patient, with practical compassion, with respect for the complexity of the problem. She asked questions. He answered them without condescension and without performing patience. When she made an inference that was wrong, he corrected her. When she made one that was right, he said yeah and moved on. At some point she realized the sublevel had grown quiet around them. The ambient vibration of the generators had settled into a background rhythm that she'd stopped hearing. And that she was, for the first time since boarding the Spire 6 weeks ago, not bored. The gala is tomorrow night, she said. I know, he gathered his papers. I'll be in the upper vents. The atmospheric processors run hot during high occupancy events, and the C17 patch won't hold forever. Stay close to the ballroom systems, she said. If anything, I'll be where I need to be. He picked up his bag and looked at her with those steady brown eyes. Your Highness. It was the first time he'd used her title since the first day. Aelvynae, she said. He considered this with characteristic seriousness. Then he nodded once and disappeared around the corridor junction. Her neck scales had been flared for the better part of an hour. She only noticed when she started climbing back up toward the formal decks, and Thalon found her in the stairwell and looked at her collarbone with an expression of barely suppressed alarm. Divine architecture, she told him before he could speak. He did not look reassured. The grand ballroom of the gilded Spire could hold 3,000 guests, and had on 3 occasions in its history held more. Its ceiling was a hemisphere of crystal lattice panels that could be polarized to show the star field above. A feature that had been, for most of the station's life, the single most spectacular sight available to hegemony citizens who couldn't afford deep space transit. Tonight it was full, warm, and loud, with the layered music of a pan-hegemony orchestra playing something in a time signature Aelvynae had never been able to follow. She stood at the top of the entry stairs in her golden gown, the structured one with the high lace-like collar that her wardrobe staff insisted was appropriate for an event of this magnitude, and surveyed the room with the expression that Thalon called her diplomatic composure, and that she privately called managing not to visibly calculate load stress. The guest list was a catalogue of hegemony power. Lord Vethros was already at the center of a group of admirers, demonstrating something with 4 of his arms that she assumed related to the Leviathan. The pellucid delegation clustered in their preferred corner, translucent skin faintly luminous under the chandelier arrays. Station staff moved through the crowd with practiced invisibility, carrying trays of compounds calibrated to the specific metabolic needs of a dozen different species. A figure near the east pillar caught her attention briefly. A guest she didn't recognize, though that was not unusual. The figure was tall, wearing the formal registration markings of the outer pellucid reaches, and stood with the particular stillness of someone who was not enjoying the party, but had their own reasons for being there. Aelvynae noted the figure and moved on. Thylon materialized. Lord Vethras has requested the honor of the first formal presentation. In a moment, she was looking at the ceiling, at the atmospheric vents, the ornamental grills that concealed the processing trunk lines, at junction C17, which from the ballroom floor appeared perfectly normal. She was listening for the vibration that would mean the patch had failed. "My lady," Thylon said with gentle urgency, "Lord Vethras is not going anywhere." She pulled her attention down from the ceiling. "He has 6 arms. He'll find something to do with them." She was an hour into the gala when she smelled it. Or rather, she didn't smell it, which was the point. She couldn't smell it. Her sensory range didn't include whatever molecular signature had just shifted in the atmospheric processing. But she saw the atmospheric vent grill above the east service corridor tremble, just once, just slightly, in a way that suggested pressure differential rather than ambient vibration. And then she looked at the east pillar, and the still tall figure in pellucid formal markings was gone. The first sign was the head guard. He was stationed near the main doors, impassive, professional, reptilian features arranged into the permanent expression of someone who found civilians mildly contemptible. He blinked, rubbed one scaled hand across his jaw, blinked again with the deliberate concentration of someone trying to resolve a visual blur. Then the pellucid dignitary nearest the east dispenser made a sound. Not quite a word, not quite pain, something between, and touched her throat with both hands. Aelvynae was moving before she'd consciously decided to. "Thylon," she said, low and fast. "Get to the medical bay. Tell them atmospheric contamination, unknown agent, ballroom. Go, my lady." He looked at the dignitaries near the dispenser. 3 of them were now experiencing the same throat-touching, blinking confusion. "Blessed architecture. Thalon, now." He went. She watched the room. It spread fast, but not the way an explosion spreads. There was no visible agent, no smoke, no visible particulate, no color change in the air. Guests simply began to experience it. First the eye blinking and throat touching, then something worse. A visible distress along the mucous membranes, a reddening and swelling that moved across the face like weather. 2 pellucid delegates collapsed. A member of the Hegemony Honor Guard, not the reptilian one, a softer tissued adjutant from the 3rd Cascade, pressed both hands over his face and made sounds that were very bad. The station's defense systems registered nothing. The atmospheric processors registered nothing. The medbay sensors, when Thalon reached them, registered nothing. The agent was outside the programmed hazard parameters, outside the known, outside the expected. Lord Vethras, who had 6 arms and a warland story, and had survived the belt of shattered core by his own account, looked around the deteriorating room, looked at the people folding to the floor, and made for the main doors with a speed that was, Aelvynae observed with a cold clarity, extremely impressive. She watched him go. She noted it with the part of her brain that would file it under confirmed and move on. The ballroom was beginning to panic, properly panic. The kind where the crowd becomes a fluid with its own physics, where 3,000 individuals become a single organism oriented toward exits. The head guard was trying to establish order at the doors, his reptilian constitution apparently granting him some resistance to the initial effects. But his voice was losing authority to the gathering chaos. Aelvynae stood at the center of it and looked at the ceiling, at the vents, the atmospheric processing system, the one running at 30% overcapacity, the one with 2 failed heat exchangers and a compounding cascade of deferred maintenance problems, was also the system that circulated everything through the ballroom, including whatever had just been introduced. She thought about what Jared had said. The station doesn't have individual problems. It has one problem that speaks in a lot of voices. She thought about the figure at the east pillar, still and methodical in borrowed formal markings. She looked up at the ventilation grills and waited, with every iota of disciplined calm she possessed, for the human in the maintenance crawlspace to either have smelled this first or be the last hope she had left. She didn't wait long. The grill above the ballroom's secondary service access, the one that Aelvynae now knew from 3 days of sub-level education, connected to the maintenance trunk corridor running parallel to the C-17 junction, came off its housing with a precise, quiet efficiency that suggested someone had already removed the mounting screws from the inside. Jared Lawson dropped 12 feet to the ballroom floor and landed in a crouch that absorbed the impact without apparent difficulty. He straightened. He was wearing his coveralls. He had a strip of cloth tied across his nose and mouth. Dense, slightly damp, clearly improvised from something in his canvas bag. And he was carrying a high-pressure chemical sprayer, the industrial kind, backpack-mounted, with a manual pump mechanism and a wand attachment, the sort of equipment used for deep-cleaning atmospheric processing units. In his other hand was a wrench. He looked, Aelvynae thought, nothing like a soldier. He looked like a man who had come to fix something. The panicking crowd parted around him partly because he'd dropped from a ceiling in their midst, and partly because he was moving with a direction so deliberate that the crowd's fluid physics reorganized itself instinctively around a solid object. The head guard materialized in front of him. "You," he started, one massive hand going for Jared's collar. "Don't," Jared's voice was flat and very steady. "Whatever's in your air is microscopic and alive. It's feeding on protein structures in your mucous membranes. That's why the swelling is starting at the throat and eyes. Your medbay doesn't have it cataloged, your sensors don't see it. And if you don't let me get to the primary atmospheric intake in the next 12 minutes, you're going to be administering last rites to about 60% of the people in this room." The head guard's hand had stopped. His expression hadn't changed exactly, but something in his eyes had. The assessment recalculating. "You're the janitor," he said. "Lead maintenance custodian," Jared said. "Move." The head guard moved. Aelvynae came forward through the thinning near crowd. Many guests had successfully panicked their way through the doors, but enough remained, collapsed or too affected to move, that the ballroom floor was becoming complicated to cross. "You smelled it," she said. He looked at her. A rapid, assessing scan from face to posture to the space around her. He seemed to confirm something. Caught it in the upper trunk line about 9 minutes ago. Didn't know what it was, but it was wrong. Animal wrong. He was already moving toward the service corridor, and she fell into step with him. "It's a biological agent. Microscopic predators, designed to target protein chain configurations common in hegemony species." The cold and mechanical phrasing. The method of deployment through the atmospheric intake, rather than direct release. This was planned. The intake for the ballroom system connects to the primary atmospheric trunk at junction C-17. She processed this. "The leak. You said the C-17 junction was connected to the entire conduit web. Someone used the existing infrastructure. The pressure differential from the slow leak created a pathway." His voice was moving fast, spare. "A bioweapon introduced at exactly the right insertion point would distribute through the whole ballroom system within minutes. Whoever did this knew the station's maintenance history." She thought of the tall figure in borrowed pellucid formal markings, standing still near the east pillar. Cold and methodical. "The assassin," she said. Jared glanced at her. "Someone who had access to station schematics," she continued. "Who knew about the C-17 vulnerability specifically. Who stood at the east pillar and then disappeared precisely when—" "Yeah," he said. He pushed open the service corridor door. "Walk and talk." The sprayer on Jared's back contained, he explained, while moving through the service corridor at a pace that Aelvynae's formal gown was not designed for. A compound he had mixed in the maintenance sub-level prep room, approximately 7 minutes after he had caught the first scent anomaly in the trunk line. "Industrial decontamination base," he said. "Human grade. It's technically not cleared for use in hegemony atmospheric systems, because your regulatory board classified it as a potential mucosal irritant for 3 out of 12 standard hegemony species types. It's a mucosal irritant," she said. "Mild mucosal irritant. Comparable to—" He appeared to search for a reference point. "Strong onion vapors, by your biological standards. The bioweapon currently eating your guest's throat linings is not mild." He paused at a junction. Checked his schematic. Turned left. "The base compound is pH disruptive. It won't kill the agents directly. The predators are too small and too adaptive, but it'll denature the protein chain scent markers they use to locate targets. They go blind, essentially. They can't feed, they don't reproduce, and in a low-nutrient environment like processed air, they die within 2 to 4 hours." She was moving through the corridor behind him. You synthesized a targeted countermeasure in 7 minutes. I combined 4 things that were already in my kit. He didn't look back. Industrial enzyme cleaner, pH buffer, aerosolizing compound, and a slight pause. Approximately 40% distilled ethanol. You put alcohol in it. It helps with aerosolization, and it's a secondary protein structure disruptor. A pause. Also, it's what I had. The service corridor branched into a maintenance access ladder. Jared went up it with the facility of someone who had spent 11 days learning every vertical pathway in the station. Aelvynae followed, discovering that her structured golden gown had approximately 0 tolerance for ladder rungs, and making peace with this in real time. They emerged into the upper trunk access, the network of crawlways and pipe corridors that ran through the Spire's skeleton like a second circulatory system. And here the quality of the air changed. Even she could tell now. There was something in it that her sensory membranes translated as faintly, wrongly sweet, layered beneath the familiar staleness of recycled atmosphere. Like something that was pretending to belong. Jared stopped at a junction, took a long, deliberate breath through his nose, eyes half closed. Still active, he said, moving with the processor current. We need to get ahead of it. Junction C17, she said. The intake. The intake for the distribution trunk, yes. He started moving again, faster. If I can introduce the neutralizer at the source, the same pressure differential that distributed the weapon will distribute the countermeasure, using the infrastructure against itself, using the station's own voice, he said, which was such an unexpected phrasing that she almost stopped walking. They were 90 seconds from the C-17 intake junction when the shadow moved. The figure that stepped from an adjacent access panel wore the same tall stillness it had worn in the ballroom, but the borrowed pellucid formal markings were gone. What stood in the maintenance corridor now was a shape that was almost but not quite human. The proportions subtly wrong. The surface of the skin carrying the faint, shimmering indeterminacy of active adaptive tissue. A shapeshifter in the space between forms. Cold eyes and a face that hadn't fully decided what it was. One hand held a blade, not an ornamental one. The neutralizer doesn't reach the intake, the assassin said, in accented but clear hegemony standard. That's all I need. Jared had already moved, not toward the assassin, but laterally, putting himself between the blade and the junction ahead, while simultaneously working the straps of the sprayer off one shoulder. The movement looked like a mistake. He was putting the equipment behind him, away from his dominant hand. Aelvynae had 3 seconds to understand what he was actually doing before it became relevant. You're between me and a plumbing junction, Jared said, to the assassin. His tone was the same diagnostic flatness he used to discuss oxidation patterns. That's not a good place to be. The assassin came fast. The controlled economic speed of someone trained in environments where hesitation was fatal. The blade was oriented for a specific target, the sprayer. Destroy the equipment, mission accomplished. Jared dropped low, not a combat drop. A maintenance drop, the kind of economical crouch used to access floor-level infrastructure. The blade passed over him. He came up inside the assassin's reach and drove his shoulder into the figure's torso with the collected, dense musculature of a man who had been fighting standard gravity his entire life, while the assassin had spent a career in variable G infiltration environments. The physics were briefly educational. The assassin hit the corridor wall. Bounced, shapeshifter physiology was adaptive at a structural level, which meant the impact was absorbed and redistributed rather than absorbed and felt, and came back with the blade redirected. Jared had the wrench in his hand. He hadn't drawn it. It had simply appeared there, the way tools appear in the hands of people for whom tools are a native language. What followed was not elegant. It was not the choreographed violence of a trained fighter operating at peak form. It was the grinding, problem-solving brutality of a man who had spent his professional life assessing the structural weaknesses of complex systems and applying precise, targeted force to the points that mattered. He used the wall, he used the floor grating. Specifically, his knowledge of which section of floor grating in this corridor had a fatigue fracture, which section would give slightly under-concentrated weight, and which section the assassin was currently standing on. He used the protruding elbow joint of a conduit pipe at head height. He used the wrench with the mechanical efficiency of its intended purpose, a tool designed to apply torque to specific points, applied to anatomy instead of plumbing. The assassin was faster, more physically adaptive, and technically superior in every skill the hegemony would have classified under the heading of combat. Jared was heavier, stronger in the specific way that low-to-the-ground, high-gravity evolved musculature is strong, and had the distinct advantage of knowing exactly where every pipe, panel, and structural hazard in a 6-meter radius was located. It ended when Jared got the wrench across the assassin's primary joint configuration at the shoulder, the equivalent point regardless of what form the shapeshifter was currently wearing, with enough torque to compromise the limb's functionality and enough follow-through to put the figure into the wall a second time. Decisively, the blade clattered on the grating. Jared stood over the assassin, breathing deliberately. He looked at Aelvynae over his shoulder. "Tie that," he said, "with whatever. There's cable in my bag." She found the cable. She used it. She had read enough engineering documents to tie a load-bearing knot, which turned out to be the relevant skill set. 6 minutes, Jared said. He picked up the sprayer and kept moving. Junction C17 was worse than it had been 3 days ago. The patch was still holding. Barely, the polymerized compound darkened and stressed at its edges. But the pressure differential from the bioweapons deployment had accelerated the fracture propagation in the conduit elbow. The junction was surrounded by a faint shimmer in the air that Aelvynae's sensory membranes translated as wrongly sweet and present and alive, in a way that atmospheric compounds were not supposed to be alive. Jared stood at the junction and looked at it for exactly 4 seconds. Then he looked at the schematic of the trunk distribution network that he had, at this point, memorized. "The intake for the ballroom is here," he said, pointing. The trunk distribution network branches from this junction through 6 secondary lines. If I introduce the neutralizer here, at pressure, it'll carry through the same distribution pathway the weapon used. "The processors are running at overcapacity," Aelvynae said. "The pressure differential. We'll push the countermeasure through faster than normal, yeah?" He was already attaching the sprayer wand to the access coupling. "That's good. We want fast. It will also put additional stress on the secondary lines. 2 of the heat exchangers are already offline." "I know," he looked at her directly. "It's going to rattle. It might trip the emergency pressure relief in the east secondary, which means the east wing atmosphere automatically shunts to containment." He paused. "The east secondary connects to the formal guest quarters wing." She understood immediately. "You'll vent the guest quarters to containment atmosphere. Secondary containment is livable, uncomfortable, breathable." He held her gaze. "Anyone in the east wing who isn't already in the ballroom gets an unpleasant night and a damage claim. Anyone in the ballroom who doesn't get the neutralizer in the next 4 minutes doesn't get an unpleasant night," she finished. "Do it." He looked at her for one more beat. Not seeking permission, she realized. Confirming that she understood what she was agreeing to. That she had assessed the situation, weighed the outcomes, and was making a deliberate choice rather than a panicked one. She held his gaze steadily. He turned to the junction. "The C17 coupling," she said. "Your patch. Needs to come out. The neutralizer goes in through the fracture point. The weapon went in through the adjacent insertion port. But this is better pressure geometry." He glanced at her. "Hold this." She held the wand. He removed the patch with careful, focused speed. The polymerized compound came away in one piece, the fracture opening underneath it. And she watched him work without flinching at the shimmer of living atmospheric threat moving through the junction in the processed airflow. He positioned the wand, checked the sprayer pressure. "When I say you turn that coupling 1/4 turn counterclockwise, it'll open the secondary feed line, and the pressure will do the rest." 1/4 counterclockwise, she confirmed. He met her eyes. "Now." She turned the coupling. The sprayer discharged into the junction with a sound like sustained pressure release. A long, forceful exhalation. And the neutralizer compound entered the atmospheric distribution network at the point of its origination and moved, carried on the overcapacity pressure differential that the Spire's deferred maintenance had been building for years, through every branch and secondary line and distribution outlet that served the ballroom level. The east secondary relief valve tripped exactly as he had predicted. Somewhere in the formal guest quarters wing, atmospheric pressure shunted to containment, and the lights went to emergency amber, and somewhere Lord Vethras, who had reached his quarters with impressive speed, experienced an unpleasant night. The shimmer in the junction faded over the course of 90 seconds. Jared stood with the empty sprayer and watched the conduit elbow where the fracture was, until the air stopped moving wrong. "It's clearing," he said. She watched his face. The economy of it, the way relief registered not as expression, but as a settling of the shoulders, a single slow breath. He pressed one palm flat against the conduit, held it there for a count of 10. Yeah, he said, quieter. It's clearing. Her neck scales had been fully extended for the past 20 minutes. She let them settle. The vizier, she said after a moment, is going to tell me this was divine architecture. Jared began breaking down the sprayer equipment with methodical hands. What are you going to tell him? She looked at the junction, at the 900-year-old infrastructure screaming in its various voices, temporarily answered, at the honest metal of the maintenance corridor, unglamorous and essential. That I finally met an engineer who listened, she said. He looked up at that, and for the first time since she'd watched him press his palm to a ceiling panel in the upper gallery, something in his face moved, brief and real and not a performance. You should get back to your guests, he said. My guests are being resuscitated by medbay staff and experiencing containment atmosphere. She didn't move. I have time. He almost smiled. She was nearly certain of it. The formal inquiry convened 9 hours later in the Spire's administrative chamber and lasted 4 days. The assassin, a shape-shifting operative from the Vethros cluster, whose identity was confirmed through the painstaking biological cataloging process that shapeshifter capture always required, was found to have acted on behalf of a faction within the succession council that had preferred the outcome of no choosing ceremony to the outcome of a choosing ceremony that didn't favor their candidate. Their methods said a great deal about their preferred candidate. Thylon, who had spent the attack night in the medical bay assisting with triage, despite being 73 years old and technically past the age of field activity, submitted his account of events in 37 meticulously organized pages and added in his own hand a footnote that he had been incorrect about the ceiling panel, and that this was not, in his considered revised opinion, attributable to divine architecture. For Thylon, this constituted a significant philosophical development. Lord Vethros submitted a formal grievance regarding the containment atmosphere incident, the unplanned decompression of the guest quarters wing, and what he described as the inappropriate deployment of unregistered chemical compounds in a formal diplomatic venue. He submitted it from his quarters, where he had been located by the head guard at the beginning of the crisis, having reached the East Wing via the emergency passage at a speed that the guard log recorded with bureaucratic neutrality, and that Aelvynae read with the particular quiet satisfaction of confirmed data. She denied the grievance. 6 arms, she noted in her denial, and not one of them deployed in the service of the guests still in the ballroom. The head guard, whose name she had learned was Commander Vreth, requested a private briefing with Jared Lawson on the station's structural condition. He came to it with a notepad and left with 12 pages of notes and, by all accounts, an expression that suggested he had spent 30 years guarding a building he had never actually looked at. Jared's 8 filed maintenance reports, previously marked for non-urgent review, were escalated to immediate mandatory action within 48 hours of the inquiry's opening. This required a bureaucratic reclassification process that Thylon described as not simple, and that Aelvynae pushed through in 6 hours by the application of high chancellery authority, and what she privately characterized as healthy impatience. The choosing ceremony was postponed. The formal announcement, issued under the High Chancellor's seal, drafted by Aelvynae herself, reviewed by Thylon, who added 3 semicolons and then removed 2 of them, stated that in light of the events of the Gala of Shadows, the High Chancellor had determined that the selection of a consort required a revised framework, one that weighted demonstrated competence and situational judgment more substantially than lineage, fleet size, or the number of nebula-dwelling megafauna one had successfully harpooned. The political reaction was immediate, loud, and varied. Aelvynae read the responses in her office with the systematic attention she gave to engineering documents, categorizing objections by type, and identifying which ones contained substantive arguments, few, and which ones were simply phrased objections to the concept of change dressed in the language of tradition, many. She responded to the substantive ones. The others she filed. She did not see Jared for 3 days after the inquiry began. He was, per the maintenance work order system that she had now insisted be routed through her office for review, occupied with the prioritized repair sequence she had personally approved. The C-17 conduit elbow, proper replacement fitting, sourced at emergency rate. the east secondary pressure relief valve, recalibration, the thermal regulator assessment in the central atrium. On the fourth day, she went down to the sublevels. He was in the foundation chamber, the one with the 900-year-old column, with the propagating fracture that had 40 years of patient history behind it. He had a crew with him now, 4 of them in matching faded coveralls, moving around the chamber's base with the concentrated attention of people who had been briefed thoroughly and taken it seriously. They were installing a series of monitoring sensors along the fracture line. Analog, direct contact, the kind that felt the structure rather than interpreted a digital signal. Jared was directing them with short, clear instructions and the particular authority of a person whose competence has become too obvious to require performance. He noticed her on the chamber threshold without startling. "Your Highness," he said, with the slight emphasis that meant he'd chosen the formality deliberately, and was indicating that he'd made a choice. "Jared," she said, returning it in kind. He came to meet her at the threshold while his crew continued working. He had new stains on his coveralls. The canvas bag was more worn than it had been 2 weeks ago. He looked, she thought, exactly the same as he had the first time she'd watched him press his palm to a ceiling panel. No different in posture or expression. As though the events of the past 4 days had been processed and filed, and were now background information. "Fracture monitoring is operational," he said. "We'll have continuous data on stress propagation. The load redistribution from the thermal regulator work upstairs has already reduced vibrational input by about 11%. Not dramatic, but it buys time for the proper column reinforcement." "How long?" "Structural reinforcement," he considered. 6 months for the primary work. Another year for full system integration and stabilization monitoring. A pause. "That assumes the maintenance reports keep getting reviewed by someone who takes them seriously." "I've arranged that," she said. He nodded. He looked at the column for a moment, with the same regard he gave all aging infrastructure. That practical compassion, that respect for complexity. "I want to commission a full structural survey," she said. "Independent. Every system, every junction, every load-bearing element from the foundation up. I want it presented to the Administrative Council, and I want the remediation schedule treated as a primary governance priority." She paused. "I would like you to oversee it." He was quiet. "Your subcontract is currently listed as external janitorial services," she continued. "The classification would need to be revised. The rate of compensation would need to be renegotiated. I've had a draft prepared." She produced a document from the structured fold of her golden gown's interior pocket. Another thing her wardrobe staff had not intended the pocket for, and held it out. He took it, read it with the focus he gave technical documents. She watched his eyes move through the pages and waited. "Chief Infrastructure Remediation Consultant," he said, reading the title she had written. "It's an invented title," she acknowledged. "I invented it 3 days ago. The hegemony bureaucratic classification system doesn't have a category for what you do, so I made one." He looked up from the document. His expression was doing the thing it had done once before. That brief, real movement that wasn't a performance. "What I do," he said, "is mostly notice things that are already happening and respond to them before they get worse." "Yes," she said. "That's the title." He looked at the document again, at the column, at his crew, working with focused efficiency on the monitoring array. Then he looked at her, steadily, with those plain brown eyes that had been looking at her for 2 weeks now, without ceremony or condescension or the particular kind of performance that came from an awareness of her rank. 72-hour patch, he said. She blinked. "I'm sorry. First time we met. I told you the C-17 patch held for 72 hours. He folded the document, carefully, precisely along existing fold lines, and put it in his coverall pocket. It held 93. Material performed better than the estimate. She considered this. "Is that relevant to my offer?" "It's relevant to my estimation methods." A pause. "Sometimes the thing surprises you." "Sometimes," she agreed. He extended his calloused hand. She took it, and this time she noticed. Because she was paying attention. Because she was always paying attention when something seemed worth it. The precise, calibrated nature of his grip. The deliberate care in it. "I'll need full access to all maintenance records," he said. "Historical, not just current." "You'll have it." "And the engineering staff need to understand that when I file a report, it doesn't go into non-urgent review. That has been made extremely clear. And the C-17 fitting needs to be beryllium compatible. Not the standard hegemony alloy. Your processing chemistry reacts differently. Jared? He stopped. Sign the document, she said. We can discuss the fittings tomorrow. The almost smile returned, more committed this time. He released her hand and produced the document from his pocket, and accepted the writing implement she offered, and signed it with the same economical precision with which he did everything else. In the foundation chamber of the gilded spire, with the 900-year-old column and its patient fracture, and the new monitoring sensors that would finally, carefully listen to what it was saying, Aelvynae watched the human who had dropped from a ceiling with a chemical sprayer and a wrench and saved 300 lives by understanding that a broken thing and a complex thing were not the same. The hegemony succession would need new frameworks, new categories. A high chancellor who had decided that competence was not a secondary virtue would, in the fullness of time, need a consort who agreed. But that was a document for another day. Today the Spire's foundation was being listened to. That was, for now, enough. 3 weeks later, Thalon submitted an addendum to his inquiry report. The crisis of the Gala of Shadows, he wrote in his meticulous hand, was resolved not by the station's designed defensive systems, which failed, not by the assembled military and political power of the hegemony's greatest dignitary guests, who proved variably useful, but by the application of a human maintenance worker's knowledge of the station's actual condition, his species' anomalous chemosensory capability, and a compound of industrial cleaning agents that technically requires a hazardous materials handling waiver under Hegemony Statute 7.4.2c. I have reviewed the relevant section of Hegemony Statute 7.4.2c. I recommend it be revised. I have also reviewed my prior characterization of station maintenance anomalies as consistent with divine architectural intent. I recommend that characterization be revised as well. The Gilded Spire is not a symbol of hegemony permanence. It is a working structure that requires maintenance, and it will stand or fall on the quality of that maintenance, not the grandeur of its chandelier arrays. This is not, I have come to understand, a diminishment of the Spire. It is a more accurate description of every great thing that has ever been built. Respectfully submitted, Thalon, Vizier of the 7th Cascade. He sent it to Aelvynae, who read it twice, and then, because some things deserve to be shared, went down to the sublevels and read it to Jared Lawson, who listened to the whole thing with his arms crossed and his head slightly tilted, in the way he had when something was being processed carefully. Then he said, "He's not wrong about Statute 7.4.2c. No, she agreed, he's not. The station hummed around them, ancient and complex and no longer entirely unheard, telling anyone patient enough to listen exactly what it needed, exactly what it had always needed, someone to pay